January 17, 1946. Fort Hunt, Virginia. The winter sun hung low over the Potomac, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of what had once been a country estate. A black Chevrolet sedan rolled through iron gates, its tires crunching over gravel still wet from morning frost. In the back seat sat General Lieutenant Franz Halder, former chief of the German General Staff, his uniform stripped of insignia, his iron cross tucked away in a confiscated trunk somewhere in the Atlantic. He pressed his face to the window, expecting ruins, expecting the scorched earth of total war. Instead, he saw children riding bicycles past white picket fences. He saw delivery trucks overflowing with bread. He saw a nation untouched by the apocalypse he had helped architect. His hands trembled. The war had ended 8 months prior, but for men like Halder, the war had never truly begun on American soil. They had studied maps of New York Harbor, calculated theoretical invasion routes through Canada, debated whether American industry could sustain a two-front conflict. They had dismissed the United States as a nation of shopkeepers and Hollywood dreamers, a mongrel democracy too soft to endure the discipline of modern warfare. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels had told them that America was rotting from within, crippled by racial division and capitalist greed. Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering had laughed at reports of American aircraft production, calling them Jewish exaggerations. Even Adolf Hitler, in his Alpine fortress, had declared that a country which banned alcohol for a decade lacked the stomach for blood. They had been wrong. The German generals who arrived on American shores between 1945 and 1946 came not as conquerors but as relics of a shattered empire. They had surrendered in Italian farmhouses, in French forests, in the rubble of Berlin itself. They had been photographed with their hands raised, their boots caked in the mud of defeat. They had expected tribunals. They had expected starvation. They had expected the same brutality they had inflicted upon the cities of Poland and Russia. Instead, they were placed on liberty ships and transported across an ocean they had once planned to dominate. And when they stepped onto the docks of New York, Norfolk, and Boston, they entered a world that defied every calculation they had ever made. The shock began before they even left the ships. American guards handed them boxes of rations, canned fruit, chocolate bars, white bread wrapped in wax paper, cigarettes with filters. General Major Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, later wrote in his debriefing notes that he had assumed the rations were reserved for officers. When he learned that every American soldier, from private to general, received the same allotment, he did not believe it. He demanded to see the supply manifests. He counted the crates stacked in the cargo hold, thousands upon thousands of identical boxes, each containing more calories than a German soldier received in a week. He sat on his bunk that night, staring at a Hershey's bar and wept. This was not the weeping of grief. It was the weeping of comprehension. For 5 years the German war machine had operated on a singular assumption, that scarcity breeds strength. That a soldier who fights for his next meal fights harder than one who takes abundance for granted. That a nation stripped to its bones becomes a blade. The Third Reich had rationed butter to produce bullets, diverted grain to feed tanks instead of children, told its people that suffering was the price of greatness. And the soldiers had believed it, because they had no reference point for an alternative. They had marched into Russia, expecting to find a primitive wasteland. They had found factories. They had invaded France, expecting decadence. They had found resistance. But America was supposed to be the ultimate soft target, a nation grown fat on peace. The convoys that transported the POWs inland only deepened the dissonance. Oberstleutnant Hans von Luck, a decorated panzer commander, recorded his journey from New York to a detention camp in Oklahoma. The train moved through New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and beyond, and at every station he saw the same incomprehensible sight: plenty. Supermarkets with plate glass windows displaying pyramids of oranges. Gas stations with lines of automobiles, not military vehicles but civilian cars, dozens of them, hundreds of them, moving freely. Farmland stretching to the horizon, untouched by craters or scorched earth tactics. He had fought at El Alamein. He had seen the Afrika Korps starve for lack of supply lines. He had watched his men siphon fuel from destroyed trucks just to move another 10 kilometers. And here in the heartland of the enemy, fuel was so abundant that teenagers drove jalopies for entertainment. Von Luck turned to the American MP seated across from him, a young corporal from Missouri, and asked, "How many factories did you lose in the war?" The corporal looked confused. "Factories? We didn't lose any factories, we built more. Von Luck thought the man was joking. Later, he would learn the truth. Between 1940 and 1945, American industrial production had doubled. The United States had manufactured 300,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, 2.5 million trucks, 6,500 naval vessels, and 40 billion rounds of ammunition. It had done this while simultaneously increasing civilian food consumption, expanding suburban housing, and maintaining full employment. The German General Staff had predicted that American industry would collapse under the weight of wartime demand. Instead, it had metastasized. The camps themselves completed the psychological demolition. Fort Hunt, Camp Ritchie, Camp Concordia, Camp Huntsville. These detention facilities were not gulags. They were not labor camps. They did not feature gallows or torture chambers. Instead, they featured libraries, baseball diamonds, mess halls serving 3 meals a day. General Major Gunther Blumentritt, former Chief of Staff to Field Marshal von Rundstedt, described his arrival at Camp Como in Mississippi as entering a sanitarium. The barracks had heating. The latrines had plumbing. The guards, many of them German-speaking second-generation immigrants, addressed the prisoners with a detached professionalism that bordered on courtesy. There were no beatings, no forced marches, no arbitrary execution. This absence of cruelty was, in its own way, more destabilizing than any punishment could have been. The German officer corps had been trained in a specific philosophy of power, that respect is earned through dominance, that mercy is weakness, that the strong do not negotiate with the defeated. They had treated Soviet POWs as subhuman. They had starved them, worked them to death, left them to freeze in open pens. They had justified this as military necessity, as the harsh logic of total war. And now, sitting in American camps, eating pancakes and playing chess, they confronted a nation that had won the war without adopting their methods. It gnawed at them. It infected their sleep. Some tried to rationalize it as propaganda. General Lieutenant Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, captured in North Africa, initially refused to believe that the camp conditions were genuine. He told fellow prisoners that the Americans were fattening them for slaughter, that the kindness was a precursor to show trials. He hoarded food in his footlocker, convinced that starvation would begin any day. It never did. After 3 months he stopped hoarding. After 6 months he began requesting books from the camp library. He read American history. He read the Federalist Papers. He read transcripts of Lincoln's speeches, and slowly, against every instinct of his training, he began to understand that the system he had served was not the apex of civilization. It was the opposite. The interrogations accelerated this realization. American intelligence officers, many of them refugees from Germany and Austria, conducted interviews designed not to extract confessions but to map the architecture of Nazi thought. They asked about logistics, about decision-making processes, about the moment when the generals realized the war was lost. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, Hitler's chief of operations, sat across from a Jewish interrogator from Brooklyn and admitted that the German High Command had never truly believed in victory after Stalingrad. They had fought on because the alternative, surrender, was ideologically unthinkable. The Reich had told them that defeat meant annihilation, that the Allies would erase Germany from the map, that every German would be enslaved or executed. And yet here was a Jewish officer offering him a cigarette, asking about his family, taking notes in perfect German. Jodl stared at his hands. "We were told you were animals." The interrogator did not respond. He simply slid a photograph across the table. It showed a crowd outside a Detroit factory, workers of every ethnicity holding signs that read, "Buy war bonds and arsenal of democracy." In the background, a banner, "We are all Americans." Jodl studied the photograph for a long time. Then he asked, "How did you do this?" It was the question that haunted all of them. How had a nation of immigrants, a democracy mocked as chaotic and inefficient, outproduced the industrialized war machine of Europe? How had a country that allowed dissent, that held elections during wartime, that debated strategy in public newspapers, managed to coordinate the most complex logistical operation in human history? The German generals had been taught that democracy was weakness, that pluralism was paralysis, that only a Führer, a singular will, could mobilize a nation for total war. The evidence before them suggested otherwise. They learned that American war production was not centralized under a dictator, but distributed across thousands of private companies, unionized workers, and competing bureaucracies. They learned that Boeing and Lockheed had designed aircraft through trial and error, not through 5-year plans. They learned that Rosie the Riveter was not a propaganda myth, but a statistical reality. 6 million women had entered the workforce, building the tanks and planes that crushed the Wehrmacht. They learned that the United States had done all of this while maintaining a free press that criticized the government, labor unions that went on strike, and a Congress that argued over every appropriation. It should not have worked. According to every principle of German military doctrine, it should have collapsed into inefficiency. But it had worked, and the proof was sitting in the mess hall every morning, in the form of eggs and bacon and coffee, and orange juice. A breakfast that German soldiers had not seen since. The symbolic weight of food became inescapable. General Major Friedrich von Breusch, captured in Tunisia, described in his memoirs the first time he was served steak in an American camp. Not canned meat. Not horse meat. Not the gristly substitutes he had eaten in the trench. Actual beef, grilled medium rare, accompanied by mashed potatoes and green beans. He had not tasted steak in 3 years. He cut into it slowly, expecting it to be a hallucination. It was not. He ate the entire portion in silence, then returned to his barracks, and wrote a letter to his wife that was later intercepted by camp censors. We have lost not because we lacked courage, but because we lacked this. We were fighting a nation that could feed its soldiers steak while our men were eating sawdust bread. The letter was filed in a report on POW morale. The analyst who read it noted, subject exhibits signs of ideological disintegration. This disintegration was not immediate. It was gradual, a slow erosion of certainty. Some generals clung to the old narratives. They blamed Hitler for tactical errors. They blamed Goering for air superiority failures. They blamed the weather, the terrain, the betrayal of Italy. But they could not blame these things for the affluence they witnessed. They could not explain away the highways or the hospitals or the high schools filled with students who would never be conscripted. They could not rationalize the fact that America had fought a global war on 2 oceans, and emerged richer than it had begun. By the winter of 1946, many of the senior officers had begun requesting books on American government. They attended lectures given by German émigrés who explained the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the concept of checks and balances. They debated whether democracy could be transplanted to Germany, whether a nation raised on authoritarianism could learn to govern itself. Some, like General Major Hans Speidel, would later become architects of the Federal Republic, helping to draft a new constitution modeled on American federalism. Others, like Jodl, would face trial at Nuremberg and hang for their crime. But all of them, in those months of captivity, experienced the same fundamental shock: the recognition that the ideology they had served was not merely defeated, but obsolete. The epilogue of this transformation played out over decades. When the surviving generals returned to Germany, they found a nation divided. The East fell under Soviet occupation, a familiar authoritarianism dressed in new rhetoric. The West, under American guidance, rebuilt itself as a democracy. It was awkward, it was imperfect, it was slow, but it was fair. The Marshall Plan poured billions into reconstruction, not as punishment, but as investment. The same abundance that had shocked the POWs in Virginia now flowed into Hamburg, Frankfurt, and Munich. Breadlines disappeared, factories reopened. Children who had grown up in the rubble of total war began to imagine futures beyond survival, and the generals who had once dismissed America as weak watched this transformation and understood, too late, what power actually meant. True power was not the ability to destroy. Any nation with enough cruelty could destroy. True power was the ability to build, to sustain, to offer an alternative so compelling that even the defeated chose to embrace it. The Third Reich had offered Germany glory through conquest. America offered Germany prosperity through partnership. One required submission, the other required participation. The choice, in the end, was not difficult. Years later, in the archives of the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center, a researcher would find a transcript of an interview conducted in 1968 with a retired German general, name redacted. The interviewer asked what he remembered most vividly about his time as a POW. The general paused for a long moment, then said, "The waste. You had so much food that you threw half of it away. We had fought a war to steal grain from Ukraine, and you were feeding it to livestock for pleasure. That was the moment I knew we had lost before we began, not because you were stronger, but because you never had to choose between guns and butter. You had both." The interview ended there, but the transcript included a handwritten note from the archivist. Subject declined to elaborate further, appeared emotional. This is the forgotten shock of 1945. Not the shock of defeat, but the shock of revelation. The German generals who arrived in America expecting vengeance, found abundance. They expected barbarism and found process. They expected annihilation and found rehabilitation. And in that dissonance, the architecture of fascism crumbled, not because it was defeated in battle, though it was, but because it was revealed to be unnecessary. The ideology that had promised strength through suffering was exposed as a con, a grift that had traded the future for the illusion of destiny. America did not defeat the Third Reich by becoming more brutal, it defeated the Third Reich by remaining itself, a loud, messy, inefficient democracy that somehow produced more steel, more planes, more food, more freedom than any dictatorship could ever imagine. The generals who had once planned its invasion ended their days marveling at its grocery store, and in that marvel, in that quiet, humiliating awe, lay the truest victory of all.